So it's my great privilege to introduce two political theologians for this session. And the first is Father Cyril Hovorun, who is a professor of ecclesiology, international relations, and ecumenism at University College, Stockholm.
Thank you for this introduction. I should say that, we try to marry the post-apartheid political theology with post-Maidan political theology in Ukraine, something that we started discussing with our colleagues from South Africa. So there is hope that there could be like a bridge built between them. In my presentation, come back to Ukraine, and I'd like to focus on children. The topic of my presentation, which I amended slightly after I submitted my paper, is War, Children, and Churches. And I'd like to begin my presentation with this picture. I stumbled on it in a park in Spain. People come and live there. There are written notes with what they wish. This child's note, pinned to a tree, reads, "I want to go home. I have been here already for 1 year, and I am from Ukraine. Glory be to Ukraine." At the bottom of the note, instead of the name, there is a line in Russian, "I'm struggling to write." This note can tell 1,000 stories. The most typical one would be the following, and this is my kind of guess. This unknown child, from age approximately 5 to 8, I would say, was taken by his or her mom from somewhere in the predominantly Russian-speaking region of Ukraine in the early months of the invasion. What might have happened to their house can be demonstrated by these pictures, which I took while randomly exploring a half-destroyed building in Izum in the Kharkiv region, which was under the Russian occupation from the end of February through September 10th, 2022. These are the pictures that I've taken. I was just by chance, entered the house and I found this. The child's father most probably stays in Ukraine, perhaps fighting. In such a case, there is a high probability that he was killed or wounded. I guess that this from my own experience of my family, my brother is fighting in a unit, and the unit that he was fighting in had 120 soldiers, and only 10 remained capable of fighting. Others were either wounded or killed. So essentially, the rate of casualty is very high. So if this child's father was fighting, he was very likely wounded or maybe even killed. Anyways, the child has not seen him for more than 1 year, apparently. It appears that the child experienced a rapid and radical transformation of identity, from rather Russian to definitely Ukrainian. While in Ukraine, it seems, the child's family used Russian in communication with one another. In exile, they began speaking Ukrainian, and the child almost apologizes for not being able to write in Ukrainian properly. He or she certainly wants to master this language and identify him or herself with Ukraine. Such an identification is encouraged and supported by the mom. Finally, this note was not something staged for a show. As I said, I stumbled on it completely accidentally and found it among many other notes written mostly in Spanish or English. There was a tiny chance one could read it in Ukrainian. It happened that I saw it. Could read it. This note was a very sincere exclamation de profundis of the child's heart, not to be made public. I apologize to the unknown child for sharing this note publicly now. This voice is one of millions of voices of children who had to leave their country to seek a safer place, together with their moms and other family members. These families have left their country against their wish, but by free will. It was their choice, and no one forced them. Thousands of other Ukrainian children were forced to leave their country against their own will and the will of their parents. It is difficult to establish how many exactly, but reportedly around 20,000 were deported to Russia. On this slide, you may see the official statistics provided by the Ukrainian government. Deportation of Ukrainian children became the first and so far the only cause for an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin, in company with the Russian Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova. According to this warrant issued by the International Criminal Court on March 17, 2023, I quote, "There are reasonable grounds to believe that each suspect bears responsibility for the war crime of unlawful deportation of population and that of unlawful transfer of population from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation in prejudice of Ukrainian children," end of quote. What happened to the children deported to Russia or staying in the occupied territories? They get re-educated in conformity with the mainstream militant ideology of Russia, which the Russians themselves call the Russian world, and which I would prefer to call Putinism. In my judgment, this is an updated version of classical fascism, into which the Ukrainian children get indoctrinated. They are taught to hate their own country, Ukraine, and to fight against it, as you can see in this slide. Ukraine's Ombudsman Office has reported multiple cases of the camps in Russia and Ukraine's occupied territories where children are trained to fight against their motherland. One such case was recently reported by Dmytro Lubinets, the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, and I quote him. "The militarization of children continues in the temporarily occupied territories. Open sources reveal that in Mariupol, the occupants plan to create a youth army training center, the first one in the TOT, temporarily occupied territories. There, children will be taught to march, operate UAVs, provide first aid on the battlefield, and restore their combat effectiveness when wounded." So they are trained really to fight and to be wounded and to be killed. "The basis of militarization is compulsory participation in propaganda events," end of quote. Such practices of the Russian Federation, however brutally they are not new. Ukraine experienced something similar in the period of early modernity, when it was a Cossack republic. Then the Ottomans took children from Ukrainian, Serbian, Bulgarian, Romanian, Greek families to re-educate them. This practice was called devshirme. Most children were trained and became known as new soldiers, Yanichere. Like on this slide, which I took actually in Khotyn fortress in Ukraine. There is reconstruction of such new soldiers, Yanichere. The early modern Ukrainian children were never reunited with their parents. Their new masters indoctrinated them to be totally loyal to the Sultan. Konstantin Mikhailovich from the Serbian Ostrovica was enslaved in the mid-15th century and could closely observe the upbringing of the Yanichari. I found this testimony, a very interesting testimony from a medieval chronicle describing his experience, this Serbian guy from Ostrovica. And I quote him, "Whenever the Turks invade foreign lands and capture their people, an imperial scribe follows immediately behind them, and whatever boys there are, he takes them all into the Yanichari, and gives 5 gold pieces for each one and sends them across the sea. There are about 2,000 of these boys. If, however, the number of them from enemy peoples does not suffice, then he takes from the Christians in every village in his land who have boys, having established what is the most every village can give, so that the quota will always be full. And the boys whom he takes in his own land are called Jelik." End of quote. The Ottomans at least paid for the children to their parents. The Russians act more brutally and simply steal them, after sometimes having killed their parents. The active involvement of the Russian Orthodox Church and its ecumenical partners make this stealing even more tragic. The Moscow Patriarchate organizes and runs the camps where the Ukrainian children get re-educated. It indoctrinates these children into a sort of political religion it has created in cooperation with the Russian state. So they are immersed, they're converted to a political religion, which is a result of this symphony or synergy between the Russian state and the Russian church. This ideologized religion is a combination of the Orthodox rituals with worshipping the Russian civilization and statehood as like deities. Not just Ukrainian children, but all Russians are coerced into this religion, which puts it on the same level as what Raymond Aron called in the 1930s religion séculaire, in application to contemporary communism and Nazism. Moreover, the Russian Orthodox Church tries to legitimize both the post-Soviet Russian political religion and new Devshirme, the Yanichari gathering, through its ecumenical partnerships. And this is a very tragic part of the story. Thus, in May 2022, it invited a joint delegation of the World Council of Churches and the WCC's related Humanitarian Act Alliance to visit its Rostov-on-Don diocese, which is on the border with Ukraine and hosts a lot of Ukrainians. The delegation accepted the invitation, despite the warnings that its cooperation with the Moscow Patriarchate could be used by Russian propaganda, and so it was. One of its members told me that they were introduced to some Ukrainian families with children, and I think it is an important testimony because I received this testimony from one of the delegates from Geneva, and he told me this story, what they experienced while they were visiting Rostov region. So according to this testimony, the children, in telling their stories, faithfully repeated the points of the Russian propaganda. They were already indoctrinated. This happened with the active support of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is thus completely complicit in these crimes. Its ecumenical partners, which still cooperate with this church, are also complicit to an extent, I believe. At the same time, Ukraine has partners that stand firmly for its deported children. In February 2024, very recently, approximately a month ago, the International Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children was inaugurated. Its goals include, I quote, bringing Ukrainian children home to their families and communities. The coalition will also focus efforts on supporting their reunification with families, end of quote. It is, importantly, co-chaired by the government of Ukraine and the government of Canada. On this occasion, I want to express my personal, and I think our people's gratitude to the people and government of Canada for their support and solidarity with the Ukrainian people, and not just in words, but also in deeds, particularly regarding the Ukrainian children. Together, I believe, we could repair at least some damage inflicted on the Ukrainian children and bring the perpetrators to justice. And I'd like to conclude my presentation with this slide I took in Boyarka. It's Banksy, as you can recognize. I like this picture. It's the original, actually, with a child throwing down Putin. I hope this will happen. Thank you for attention.
Thank you, Father Hovorun. Our second distinguished speaker is Dr. Pavlo Smytsnyuk.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here. So I'll be speaking about the Holy See's neutrality and the moral high ground. The Roman Catholic Bishop of Kyiv-Zhytomyr, Vitaly Krivitsky, in response to a question regarding the possibility of Pope Francis visiting Ukraine, declared, I quote, "A part of the population didn't welcome some of the Pope's words concerning the war in Ukraine, which were considered wrong. The Holy See can play a fundamental role as mediator between us and Russia. Negotiations need conciliators, and the Pope is such a person, although some here no longer consider him as being super partes, neutral," end quote. Bishop Krivitsky's words are expressive of an uneasy position in which a local Catholic Church find itself in Ukraine, struggling to reconcile the way in which this war is seen by their members and fellow Ukrainians on the one hand, and by the Vatican on the other hand. Krivitsky's words echo critiques from those who accuse Pope Francis of not being willing to explicitly name and unequivocally condemn Russia for its aggression against Ukraine. While the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church has a long history of uneasy relations with the Pope and the Holy See, a reproach of the Pope by the Latin Rite Catholics is a rather rare event. The aim of my paper is to provide perspectives for interpretation of the Holy See's and Francis's reaction to the war. I will skip the part where I give an account of the Vatican statements and movements since the start of the war, which I assume are well known. If not, you can go and find the draft paper in the docs folder. I will instead try to make sense of them, to explain them. I argue that there are two key interpretative lenses. First is the social doctrine of the Catholic Church regarding war and peace, which has been shifting in the direction of pacifism. And I have an article on the topic. And the second one would be the Holy See's neutrality. on which I will focus today. I will also speak about Francis's personal touch, marked by his intention toward what he calls periphery and the abandonment of Eurocentrism. Now, the Holy See's engagement in international relations has a complexity which distinguishes it from that of other international actors. The Vatican is unique, sui generis. The Pope, as a two-faced Janus, represents both what belongs to God and what belongs to Caesar. He is both a bishop and a head of a state. So, the Holy See was far from being silent about the war in Ukraine. Only during the first year of the war, there has been more than 100 statements by the Pope about the war, which is much more than what any Pope has done about any other conflict. So there is no silence. There is a lot of being said. However, his Pope Francis's words and actions in support of Ukrainian victims have been often counterbalanced by expressions of admiration for Russian culture, empire, and literature. Francis managed to irritate both belligerent parties. Many of his statements have provoked controversy, as did his very recent words about Ukraine rising white flag. The Holy See, at the same time, has clearly expressed its interest in mediation and has charged Cardinal Matteo Zuppi with a diplomatic mission which focused in particular on Ukrainian children. Father Hovorun spoke about this. Francis apparently has helped to do some POW exchange and bringing Azov prisoners back home. So, what is neutrality and how does it work with the Vatican? The Vatican independence from empires and nation-state has been a way to diminish foreign pressure on the Pope and enhance his moral authority internationally. The Lateran Treaty of 1929 declared the Holy See to be neutral, extraneous to all temporal disputes between states, but allowed to practice international mediation in the cases when the contending parties make concordant appeal to its mission of peace. The Holy See attempted more or less successfully to keep neutrality during both world wars. During the World War I, Catholic Austro-Hungary was fighting Catholic Italy, and both parties pressured the Pope to take their sides. The Holy See considered the Habsburg Empire to be its major ally against liberalism, and at the same time it urged the Emperor to make territorial concessions in order to find a peaceful settlement. So it won't be the first time the Vatican suggests to give away a part of somebody's territory. During the World War II, as historian Frank Coppola puts it, the Vatican resisted denouncing either Nazi or Bolshevik atrocities, hoping that they would destroy one another. Pope Pius XII's silence on both Nazis and Soviet brutalities became the object of many critiques, and the book which has the title Hitler's Pope, dedicated to Pope Pacelli. In the aftermath of the World War II, while the Holy See was concerned with the Soviet Union, it was also suspicious of the US with its predominantly Protestant culture and consumer capitalism. Very interesting is the position of the Holy See regarding NATO and Italy's membership in the NATO. At the beginning, the Vatican was a little bit concerned that to find itself in a territory which belongs to NATO, but later it convinced members of the Italian political elite to support de Gasperi's vision of Italian membership in NATO. I think that provides a little bit of context about Francis's words about NATO barking at Russia's doors. Vatican itself was complicit in NATO's expansion. The Vatican's relations with the Eastern Bloc were more complicated. the papacy tried both to condemn communist ideology and to find practical accommodation with the communist regimes, known as Ostpolitik. Yes, and Bogdan Bucurki wrote a lot about this. I think the last copy of his book has been just bought, but you probably can find another one in the magazine. As Bucurki argues, the Holy See has desisted from any direct public condemnation of Soviet persecution of the Ukrainian Catholic Church. The Curia spokesmen have been arguing in private that such a condemnation would not improve the position of the Catacomb Church, but would only harm the Vatican's other initiatives vis-à-vis the USSR and its client states, end quote. No wonder that Ostpolitik was perceived badly by many Catholics in the East. A specific feature of the Holy See's diplomatic style that is its willingness to speak with almost everybody. As Victor Gaetan has argued, a key thing about the Church's manner of dealing with political leaders is that they are seen as human beings, both sinful and capable of redemption. John Paul II met Castro, Pinochet, the Pope sent Cardinal Echegaray to meet Saddam Hussein, and all sorts of other dictators. In 2018, the Holy See has signed an agreement which was never made public with the communist China and provoked a lot of criticism, both in Hong Kong, in US, and other countries. François Mabille argues that in order to defend Catholics, I quote, there is a sort of indifference of the Holy See towards the political regime of the states with which it interacts, end quote. This neutrality sometimes bears fruit. The Vatican role in mediation between US and Cuba, for example, was very successful. The negotiations which then led to re-establishment of diplomatic relations between Castro and Obama were made in the Vatican, where both parties negotiated. Cardinal Parolin often would meet with both delegations. It was more than just providing a physical space for negotiations. At the same time, in a way, both parties enjoyed the trust of the Holy See, and this implied that the Holy See wouldn't criticize Cuba about its treatment of Catholics or not criticize US on some other accounts. I think a part of the calculus of the Holy See in being neutral on Ukraine was that it would open doors for mediation. In a way, keeping channels open with both would be an important asset in this aspiration. However, the Holy See's explicit mediation proposals to Ukraine and Russia were not accepted. And it might raise questions to the extent to which the aspirations to mediate were ever realistic. I wonder whether the public and media pressure on the Pope to do something was not overly naive and oblivious to limited Vatican links to the institutions in both Ukraine and Russia. And this is an important difference between US and Cuba. If you look all the contacts, informal friendships, dinners that Vatican officials have and Catholics in those countries have had with their public officials, there is nothing of that sort happening between the Holy See and Ukraine or Russia. An important issue to understand neutrality under Francis is his idea of periphery. So if the allergy to naming and shaming is not only Francis's, but basically it's a long tradition in the Vatican, if Ostpolitik is a long tradition, then I think Argentinian Pope's contribution to what was going on is his idea to periphery and, in a way, prioritizing the global South vision as compared to the West. So he says that we need to look at the world through the lens of periphery. And this implies remapping. Francis tries to decenter the West and Europe and to transcend the identification of Christianity with these regions of the world. So the fact that Ukraine is supported by the West and Europe plays a bad game in this calculus. One could wonder to what extent Bergoglio's interest in Russia is informed by some of Latin American anti-USA prejudice. Morozzo della Rocca argues that in geopolitics, Francis is in favor of a multipolar balance, an ideal which the Pope shares with Russia, China, India, Brazil, and with other large emerging countries, but not with the USA. Similarly, Adriano Roccucci argues that in France's understanding, Russia plays the role of a balance against hegemony of some others, by which he implies the USA. Ironically, President Putin claims to have a similar agenda. The invasion of Ukraine is a battle against Western hegemony and a step toward a multipolar world. While being innovative in decentering the West, Francis continues the line of Ostpolitik, and the Havana meeting with the Patriarch Kirill is part of this tendency. Even the idea of hosting this meeting outside of Europe, yes, in Cuba, is sort of a sign of his desire to decenter Europe. The failure of the Holy See to recognize the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine, I think, is completely reminiscent of Ostpolitik logic. The Vatican approach to this issue, which echoes Russia's position, prevents Francis from engaging with one of the key religious players in Ukraine. Unlike the neutrality of some other international actors, the Holy See approach to diplomacy has a theology behind it. The New Testament contemplates a universal mission of the Church addressed to all nations, and the etymology of the Catholic points to a universality, which, at least in the West, has been interpreted as a geographic universality. While during the first millennium, the effective authority of the Bishop of Rome was delimited to the West, the second millennium and the Papa Universalis claimed geographically unlimited jurisdiction. The loss of temporal power by the papacy enhanced its self-understanding as an agent with a universal mission, which transcends the borders of the Catholic Church. Modern papacy addressed itself to all men of goodwill. Maybe they will include women at a certain point. And it's committed to serve the humanity as such. In his address to the United Nations, Paul VI interestingly compared the universal mission of the Catholic Church to that of the United Nations. I think it's an interesting question to political theology, to what extent globalism influences the way Catholic Church interprets its universality today. For Pope Francis, not siding with one party transcends the domain of politics. In an interview with Dominique Walton, the Pope claimed that he doesn't like to be called the Pope of the poor because, I quote, it's an ideological nickname. No, I'm not everybody's. No, I am everybody's Pope, of the rich and of the poor, end quote. In other words, even on issues so dear to this Pope, called by some on the right as a communist, even on the issue so dear to him as the question of the poor, he doesn't want to identify himself with one group. And I think this applies, mutatis mutandis, to the war in Ukraine. Although his solidarity is clearly on the side of the suffering Ukrainian victims, he doesn't think of himself as the Pope for Ukrainians only. Finally, the Holy See's neutrality can be understood as a particular understanding of the separation of the religious and the secular spheres. The political sovereignty of the Vatican is subordinated to the spiritual mission of the Pope. From this perspective, as Gerard Powers suggests, the Holy See's neutrality is an expression of its respect for the relative autonomy of the secular order, which implies that it leaves it to the ethicists, policymakers, military leaders, and citizens to make those prudential moral judgments. Now to my conclusion. Neutrality makes mediation possible. However, another precondition of mediation mentioned by scholars is moral legitimacy. There are moments when, as Matuzzi puts it, pragmatism contrasts with the diplomacy of truth. The Vatican's naming and shaming Russia would make the former an unqualified mediation in the eyes of the Kremlin. But the Vatican's silence breeds distrust in Ukraine. There is no easy choice here. But if, as George Weigel says, the moral authority is the only real authority of the Holy See and the Pope have in the modern and postmodern worlds, then the possibility of keeping a moral high ground should be prioritized over the potential for mediation. An important issue regarding Francis' focus on the periphery is that periphery or center is experienced differently from different peripheries. US or Russian hegemony is experienced differently from Latin America and Eastern Europe. In one case, hegemony can be perceived as oppressive, in other one as liberating. It remains unclear what is the center and what is periphery in the current war from the Vatican's perspective of neutrality. Does Francis read this conflict as an act of Russian imperialism against Ukraine? Or conversely, it is a periphery, Russia, that is protecting itself from the hegemonic center, the West, as the papal words on the NATO barking and Russia's doors implies. Let me end by citing Katie's and Tatiana's paper from the previous panel. Trust is essential to create two-sided willingness to foster hope for increased understanding via empathic swapping of perspectives, end quote. The Holy See has practiced a very curious neutrality around the Russo-Ukrainian war. Instead of building trust with Ukraine and Russia, if it was ever possible, but it is an art, they managed to be friends with both US and Cuba, both with the UK and Iran. So instead of building trust with Ukraine and Russia, it has been neutral in the sense that it has irritated both parties and given world a lesson in negative neutrality. Such an approach has reaped few dividends in opening the door for mediation, but many other international players have achieved even less. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Smytsnyuk. Our respondent is Dr. Frank Sysyn from the University of Alberta.
So we have reached discussion of international religious organizations and the contact with war, and I hope this will also be continued into our roundtable. I think this is an extremely important panel, and I'm grateful to both of our speakers for dealing in very different ways, but to two extremely important issues. So to make a few comments first on the issue of war children, but also something that reflects the World Council of Churches, and I would extend that in various countries to the National Council of Churches in countries like the US and wherever such organizations exist outside, and what this brings to us. First of all, we were all moved by the beginning of the topic, although I'm not so sure we can know that the little boy had Russian identity. We know he was a Russian speaker, and I think that's one of the things that we learned. It would be interesting to know, but obviously a change in identity had occurred, and it was a wonderful moment to bring to us. But above all, what we have seen gone on is a declaration by Moscow and as well by the Russian Orthodox Church of what the proper identity of much of the population of Ukraine should be. I don't know if anyone has studied this carefully enough to see, but it already seems that in some ways Jews are being siphoned out of maybe that collective identity of the population of Ukraine, and there may be other groups as well as time goes on to see that. That is, how much it's related to a declaration of the identity of what might be called at least Orthodox, maybe Eastern Christians, although we don't know if the Galicians will fully be part of that. But what I think above all this topic brings up has been the most important international topic that has involved both churches and international organizations, that most clearly to the Western eye, or whatever we will call outside the global South, has clearly been one of the planks of the Genocide Declaration, and therefore almost puzzling as to why Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church would involve themselves in this. I think this has had more resonance than any other topic in turning a Western public and church groups among them against the Russian invasion. What I particularly don't have an eye for, and I wonder whether those from Ukraine and those who know Russia well might have a better feeling of how publics receive Maria Lvova-Belova. Obviously, to, I think, most eyes outside, someone who is hideous, both in the presentation, but as she presents herself, at least at the times I have heard her. Although, on the other hand, it has had the declaration that we are taking, after all, those children largely who've been put away by families who didn't care for them well into various internate and other such, and are giving them homes. And I take it that's had resonance with some of these delegations. And I would be curious if you would talk about, provide any more material on that, as to quite how this fits into the Putinism that you have presented to us. I am not so sure if you can call Putinism classical fascism. I don't want us to get involved in the endless debates on what fascism is on it. But where I think it absolutely does have resonance is that this is part of a policy of selecting people, children, for the fatherland and the cause, almost in the same way that the Germans picked out various Aryan types who could be accepted into German nation when they turned to the Polish and other populations. There is something that then, therefore, is reminiscent of it. I was pleased as an early modernist to hear about the Deschirme. I think interesting as a comparison, although difficult perhaps to fully see what the Russian plan was. What I also thought in this is the other part we can take from this earlier period is Marusia Bohuslavka as well. What this also will involve for the populations, the attempt to retrieve people. How do you bring them back from this Russian identity towards the Ukrainian identity? The heroic mothers and grandmothers who go off to find these children, and then the 15 or 16-year-olds mouthing some of the Russian propaganda. Now, of course, Marusia decided that she was no longer, and here we can go back to our purification discussion, she had already been contaminated by too long from her Muslim life, that you all go back to the land of freedom, I won't go on it. I thought that, in a way, the fate and the identities of those children, I have hopes will get the kind of counseling that is so lacking anywhere else in Ukraine. But I think more directly on this, what I wonder from the point of view of what might be called the Putin ideology, and particularly that which it sells to Mr. Orban and Mr. Trump and the Republican Party in the US, has, of course, changed the nature of what family is. That is, ostensibly, these are all groups who are very pro-family, but in a certain way now, the state and the causes of the Russian world supplant the family, become more important than the family. Wonder how the church groups that deal with this. And what I would hope that you can give us is a little bit more of a discussion of your discussions with the World Council of Churches people, those who have been there, how they are dealing with this situation and justifying it. We know about the conflicts which occurred in various church meetings between the Global South and the North in these international organizations. We know about the position of the Russian Orthodox Church within these international organizations and why their desire to have strong structures sometimes keep them from moving and moving in the way they should. but anything that you could provide with us would be useful. And then how this all affects ecumenism. Is their definition of ecumenism such that it doesn't allow them to move on it? So those are rather stray comments. Now I turn to the discussion of the penetration of the mind and thought of Pope Francis. We have had a good fortune to have, I think, a very solid plank in the talk we have heard dealing with this issue of neutrality, which I think is extremely important, as well as dealing with concepts of the global south. Those of you who have had the chance to read the paper may see it is much richer, but I must say, in the end, it is very hard to put it all together either in the paper, just as it is so hard to figure out, at least to me still, in the policies of the Pope and where they have gone. So we've had, I think, one interesting presentation on it. I think very important was for those of us looking at Ukraine and religion in Ukraine, was the initial comment on not the head or the main hierarch of the Roman Catholic Church, which I think is very interesting in Ukraine, but at least a bishop who is clearly Ukrainian in ethno-cultural background, I take it, making a strong statement. And here, since the kind organizers gave me credit for advising on them, we can also say that anything that's lacking was my fault. And so one thing I think we could have dealt with more is the Roman Catholic Church in Ukraine, because of particularly international context and contacts with the papacy. But that the Roman Catholic Church has come that far in criticizing the Pope. Well, I guess at this point, if the Lithuanian, by nationality, nuncio also seems to criticize the Pope, is not to be totally unexpected. But it's also, I think, very interesting for the mix in Ukraine and its plurality, where the Roman Catholic Church stands, how it's been able to become quite fully a patriotic Ukrainian church and live in an interesting relationship with the Ukrainian Catholic Greek Church, Greek Catholic Church. I think that the neutrality argument is very good. It might, I think, be strengthened by a discussion of some of the research of Liliana Hentosh on the Polish-Ukrainian War of 1918-19, when the Vatican had to deal with two Catholic peoples fighting each other and decided it had to be very careful. Obviously, Sheptytsky's influence helped in this considerably. As far as I remember, she also begins to deal with this issue of how the Vatican comes up to say that it is not going to take sides in that war, and might add a Ukrainian aspect to your discussion. Extremely interesting was, of course, bringing up from our beginning lecture, Professor Buciurkiu and his work on Ostpolitik. I think the points you make are extremely valid, that the Ukrainian Catholic Church has made an entire policy, and relatively successfully, of opposing the Vatican in its loyalty. I think we have to return to the patriarchal movement, which, when we discuss this as well, which can't be left out of the discussions. You brought up the issue of the cardinal's hat. But on the other hand, at least it doesn't have to only deal with Pope Francis. The Ukrainian Catholic Church has been remarkably successful at setting up an international structure, which has at the moment worked much to the advantage of Ukraine. I don't know less about Canada, I must say, in this, but as far as I know, the Roman Catholic Church in the United States has been extremely generous in its support of many causes in Ukraine, and much of that has come through the organization of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, but also that the Ukrainian Catholic Church has become this immense international church, not only with the church in Ukraine, has changed religious situations greatly, does not have seemed to have affected the Pope's vision of it, and certainly never seems to bring the major reason why we were given that there couldn't be a patriarchate because Ukraine, there was no church within Ukraine, still seems not to have been overcome 30 years after Ukrainian independence. When you talked about the Pope and his policies, I thought about the hackneyed phrase we keep hearing that there'll be no decision about Ukraine without Ukraine. And yet the Pope seems to want to do it that way. Maybe I'm going overly far, but generally, the phrase that is very empty by many Western politicians doesn't even get mentioned by the Pope. And indeed, I think, if I remember earlier statements, we got that he had listened to the sage advice of Orban on some of these matters and others, but relatively little about Ukraine. And of course, the lack of the papal visit, which is so outstanding. I take it planned, as you say, and then called off. And if you would comment a bit on that, it would be useful. You brought up the Global South. I wonder if you also could give us some comments on the Pope and his relation with the various united churches, and if this at all plays a role in the Global South. At least the United Churches of India are a major component of the entire non-Latin Rite Catholic Church. Does that have any resonance at all with the papacy? Another would be to comment on relations with the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople, because in a certain way, the policies outlined and relation with Moscow seem to be dismissive not only of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but also of the ecumenical patriarchate. If you see Pope Francis as having a policy there, he's interested in the Global South. What does he think of the policies of the Patriarchate of Alexandria and the relations in Africa? Is this at all something that comes into any of his thinking on it? And then the final thing is, if the Pope has been irritating, I would argue he has irritated Ukrainians immensely more than he has Russians. And that would be the one thing I would like to hear you amplify on. That is, there are those who have posed of late that it is really an FSB operation that's going on in the Vatican, that this white flag was just one more example of the way they have effectively used the Pope. Of course, these people, some would begin this even in Havana when they discuss it. If you would give us your views on, do you think that this is much overblown, has no real substance to it, or there may be something for it? And then just the way it seems that the Russian, at least propaganda, seemed quite delighted with the white flag. So are those irritations really so deep, or they would have expected them anyway and basically have gained on it? Okay, thank you.
We will now collect some questions before we give it over to our speakers for a response.
A couple of questions for Pavlo. The first one, to what extent you think the experience of Pope, personal experience of living under this military dictatorship in Argentina and living in the times of dirty war in that country, to what extent it's important to understand his approach to both to the war, to Russia, to everything around. The second question, you was speaking about this periphery, the focus on periphery. I wonder why this logic does not work, or this approach does not work for him in the opposite side, as Ukraine is periphery for the Russian Empire, which deserves more focus than the center, which deserves more support as than the center. Because this is something I see clear parallel with American leftists in this regard, because they do accept the decolonization framework for Global South. At least many of them seems to be, frankly, don't understand why the same or decolonization framework can be applied to Russia-Ukraine relations.
This question's for Father Hovorun. Has the Moscow Patriarch's complicity in running indoctrination camps for kidnapped Ukrainian children led to new cases brought before the International Court of Justice? And does the court only adjudicate allegations against specific individuals, or can the entire institution be held accountable?
My question is to Pavlo. Catholic Church is a global transnational organization with significant resources. Therefore, when it hears slogans like an independent church for an independent nation or one church, one nation, it's not so easy to get on the same page, for example, in Ukraine or Romania, where these phrases are taken for granted. And at the same time, the Russian Orthodox Church, while needless to say, been much smaller than the Catholic Church, but it's transnational, and it has significant resources thanks to the alliance with the state of the Russian Federation. So basically, we have a situation when initially the starting point, being transnational, having resources, already brings like a common point to start with. Do we actually have a rather large failure of communication to start with, because the Ukrainian side who is trying to communicate actually underestimates the starting position of transnational versus independent church for independent nation, which of course sounds rather strange from Vatican's perspective. Thank you.
We have one more online question. This one's for Pavlo. To what extent does the Pope's neutrality take account of the frustration of Greek Catholics in Ukraine and their commitment to the quote-unquote Orthodox dimension of their identity and their historically proven capacity, when sufficiently pushed by the Vatican, to bolt?
I would just maybe ask for a quick clarification, if I could. I think you mentioned, Pavlo, that the Catholic social doctrine was shifting towards pacifism. And I'm wondering, what do you see are the dynamics pushing that shift? How do they understand pacifism? You know, we talked yesterday about the difference between, let's say, nonviolence and pacifism.
Thank you very much for the questions and all the comments. So nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Is it something that Pope has dear for himself? Are there FSB operations going on in the Vatican? One clear moment which I can see is that Francis takes decisions slightly differently as compared to his predecessors. So Vatican has a huge machine, a big diplomatic service, competent diplomats. Many expressions, if not all of them, which have irritated the public, have been done in the interviews or when Pope was talking to his fellow Jesuits, traveling abroad and then have been published, or when he was giving press conferences on a plane. Yes, after being jet-lagged after a trip. Those statements that have been written and probably verified with the political diplomatical offices in the Vatican are usually well balanced. The Secretariat of State very early on, at least after 4 or 6 months, has, for example, acknowledged the right of Ukraine to be armed, which is something that the Vatican didn't do, for example, during the first Gulf War, etc., in other cases of clear aggression. My understanding is that Francis was elected sort of as a anti-establishment guy. He distrusts the structures. There is a bit of anti-clerical within him. So he skips on many different things, appointments of bishops, documents, all LGBT diplomatic things. He skips the normal line of discussion. His positions seem pro-Russian, seem irritating, because I think he ignores those bureaucratic steps. And it's unclear who informs, who actually influences his own position on Ukraine. He met some of my colleagues from Ukrainian Catholic University, and the meetings were arranged by their Protestant friends from Argentina. And they were met and got, 3 hours of Pope's attention, while Archbishop Shevchuk, had 40 minutes, 1 year later. Who advises Pope? I suppose he trusts a lot of his Jesuit links, people from Latin America who would view the conflict from a certain perspective. The question about the Vatican and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. I'm not sure that he is very irritated by their desire to be an independent sui juris church. He might be more irritated by their right-wing position on many ethical issues. For example, Ukrainian Greek Catholics were among the first who have challenged this new document on the gay blessings by saying this, we won't do this because it doesn't correspond to our understanding of blessing. Ukrainian Greek Catholics often side with right-wing bishops or think tanks in the US, and in this way challenge the Pope. So if there is an allergy, it would be more to ideological fights, or as we discussed yesterday with Father Cyril, cultural wars preferences of Ukrainian Greek Catholics. Constantinople and Moscow, who is a bigger friend for the Vatican, and how do they see nationalism in Ukraine and one church for one state? From what I understood from my conversations with people in the Vatican Secretariat of State, the Dicastery for Christian Unity, is that for them nationalism is a big problem. They often cited nationalism as the reason why they don't want to recognize the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and cooperate with this church. I think on this issue they are closer to Russia than to Constantinople. Although for them neutrality often means don't do anything. So we don't recognize the Orthodox Church of Ukraine because we are neutral. So we prefer to do nothing. More or less like WCC, who have decided, we will not include the Orthodox Church of Ukraine as a member until the war is not over because we are neutral. No, so it's a very tricky understanding of neutrality. Dmitro's question about why Ukraine is not periphery. I think it depends from where you look like. I think that Francis would be close to Chomsky or other people view the world from the Latin American continent. For the Latin Americans, the hegemonic power is the US. All the rest is periphery. That's my take. But it's very ambiguous. To be consistent with his preference for periphery, he should see Ukraine as a periphery invaded by a hegemonic power, which is Russia. And finally, to Katie's question about this shift toward pacifism. In the documents, you have just war theory, and Ukraine is exercising its right to legitimate defense. However, since 1960s, in Pacem in Terris, the Vatican has been doing what is called restrictive application of the principle. One of the reasons is the nuclear weapons. They say, this is a traditional doctrine, but it was valid before we got nuclear weapons. Now with the nukes, it doesn't apply anymore. What you can hear from France is very often that it's an arm trade. To arm Ukraine means you need to produce arms, arm lobby, etc. So I understand the concern, because to arm Ukraine, you also need to give insurance to arm-producing companies that you will buy arms for another 10, 20 years. I think this is one of the calculus, which has led Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti, in his encyclical, to say that the just war theory should be reconsidered. And there is a huge debate about Catholic ethicists where he rejects the just war theory, means that you don't have any more the right to defend yourself with force, or it's just an invitation for dialogue. Francis has used in one of his World Peace Day addresses non-violence as part of the title. Really, titles don't mean much. They are not used consistently. Pacifism, non-violence, just war, peacemaking, just peace, they are used, but scholars who dealt with them don't see a lot of there. And finally, about Argentina and dirty wars. I thought about that and Maldives conflict, etc. There is a scholar who is called Gustavo Moreno. He's an Argentinian Jesuit, I think in Boston College, who has dealt a little bit with that, like Pope's position about that and how it might influence his take on the war. My feeling is that for him, especially the Maldives war is an example when you don't know your own strengths, you don't know your own forces, you engage in a war which you will lose. Don't do this. And maybe white flag can be, I think, read through this Argentinian experience during the Maldives war. But it's my speculation. I should look more deeply into that. Thank you.
Well, first of all, to respond to Frank Sysyn's comments, the issue of family, which is important, which is on the banners of the Conservative International, as it were, that includes Orban, includes Putin, some Trumpists, and so forth. That is the paradox that I often address in my presentation. Like, I remember there was a conference in June last year in Torun in Poland. I was invited to speak about Ukraine, and I realized that the audience there were those people who seemingly protect, traditional values. There was an official from the Orban's government, for example. There were some conservative Polish politicians and figures. I brought them the paradox of this campaign for the traditional values and for the family. Look, Russia pretends that it protects the family, the institute of family, and yet the family as an institute has been almost destroyed in Ukraine. It's not just the cases of families that have suffered. It's the institute of family that has suffered. Because look, almost every family has been affected by the war. If the family is not destroyed, like physically, when like a parent is not killed or died, when a child is not deported, then many families have become dysfunctional. They are separated, with millions parts of families having immigrated to the West. It's unclear whether they will reunite eventually. There will be a family reunion when the wives will decide to go back to Ukraine. Even if they are in Ukraine and their husbands are in the front line, the husbands come back to the families and they feel alienated. They prefer to go back to the front line than to stay with their wives. That is a reality that I've experienced myself. I mean, that's the first-hand experience. Virtually every single family has been affected in Ukraine by the war in very negative ways. So the family is either destroyed or dysfunctional, or are close to become dysfunctional. And that is the result of this war, of this seemingly campaign for the families. Certainly it is an instrumentalization of the families. And that is the thing that Putin does. He instrumentalizes everything. He instrumentalizes the idea of human rights. He instrumentalizes the idea of family. He instrumentalizes the idea of the dialogue, of partnership, and you name it. He has managed even to instrumentalize poor Habermas. Well, this kind of active engagement that Habermas preaches made Germany somehow captive of those Putin's policies. Well, finally, I think Germany realized that it's like a trap to this sort of engagement promoted by this train of thought. So essentially, Putin instrumentalizes the left-wing, leftist ideologies. He instrumentalizes the right-wing ideologies. He doesn't care about the consistency of his instrumentalization. He just applies it to everything, including the partnerships like the ecumenical partnerships. That is done by Putin himself personally, but certainly by his partners in the Russian Orthodox Church. What the Russian Church does, it does the same, instrumentalizing everything which is instrumentalizable, including the ecumenical movement, including the long partnerships with the WCC. The thing is the WCC understands that it is being used. From my conversations with the top officials in the WCC, for example, I had like long sheets of exchange with them when we discussed, and they are fully aware they are being used, and they're happy. They don't object for a number of reasons, because it fits their own agenda. And people in the Russian Orthodox Church, they understand very well the nature of the WCC. They understand the sensitivities, the kind of trends, including undercurrents in the WCC, and they use it. They very well understand that the WCC has become very much ideologized. It is being kind of driven to this post-colonial global south agenda. We see how it works in the WCC regarding also the attitude to the Russian Orthodox Church. If you look, for example, the exchange between Patriarch Kirill and, at that time, Father Ioan Sauka, who was the acting General Secretary of the WCC, in the period of Karlsruhe, the General Assembly of the WCC. Actually, what they believed, and it has become like carved into stone. The WCC, in the time of the beginning of the invasion, issued some statements that essentially put the two sides of the war on the same footing. Like Sauka, for example, appealed to both Zelensky and Putin. It's up to you to stop this war, as if it was up to Zelensky at least. And it continues the WCC continues to render its own messages in the same way, of seemingly balanced way, of putting the two parts of the, as they say, the conflict on the same footing. Kirill sent a letter to Sauka where he rendered the entire war exactly in the terms of this global counterposition between the hegemony of the evil forces of the West and the rest of the world. And he essentially, of course, physically, naturally ascribed Russia to the victims of the Western hegemony. He knew, and he still knows, how to play this card, and he does it very masterfully. The WCC buys into it. It's not a game of, useful idiots versus those who use them. The WCC are not useful idiots. They know what they do. They know what it is about, and they comply with this. They play into this. They accept to play this role. Yes, it confirms, corroborates their own agenda, certainly. It also plays into this agenda of partnership. Partnership is very important for the WCC. Like Father Ivan Savka, for example, told me that he doesn't want to be the General Secretary of the WCC under whom the WCC was reduced by excluding the Russian Orthodox Church. He wanted the Russian Church to continue to be in the WCC, just for the sake of what they call the partnership and the dialogue. Of course, there is my speculation about why they wanted the partnership of the Russian Church to continue with the WCC. It's a purely speculation. But it comes from the experience, like the anamnesis of the Russian participation in the WCC, when the Russian Church protagonized the process of what they call the Special Commission of the Orthodox Participation in the WCC. It started after the meeting in Thessaloniki in 1997-98. They raised the question of whether it makes sense for the Orthodox to continue participating in the WCC. That process was led by Metropolitan Kirill at the time, by the Russian Church, which really was considered as a threat, as an existential threat by the WCC. They realized that one day they could find themselves a union of the Protestant churches, not more than that, with the lack of the Orthodox and the Catholic Church not participating in the WCC. So that threat was created by the Russian Church, became really an existential threat. And I believe the WCC is hopeful to eliminate this threat in any future, understanding that the Russian Church will feel like indebted to the WCC, for the WCC allowing the Russian Church to operate, to be a part of the WCC, but at least the Russian Church will not lead a revolt, an Orthodox revolt against, the WCC. So that's one of the possible explanations why the WCC wants this kind of partnership. Of course, there are other explanations and theories, including like bribes and blackmail, whatever, the usual thing that the ROC does in application to other churches and organizations. Then there was a question about how does it affect ecumenism. It does affect ecumenism badly. You become ideologically biased, as it has happened to the WCC. Certainly it affects your main mission. It is supposed that the ecumenism is the main mission of the WCC, but it seems that the WCC does not always care about this main mission, ecumenism. It has become something that I call the ideological ecumenism. It started, I think, under Benedict XVI, when the Russian Church came up with this initiative, which was actually initiated by Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeev at the time, to set up a sort of alliance on the basis of traditional values. Essentially, the Russian Church tried to sell to the Vatican this idea that let's have a partnership, ecumenical partnership on the basis of the traditional values. Fortunately for the Catholic Church, they did not buy into this. Benedict was wise enough, even though apparently he resonated somehow with this idea, knowing him, but he was a good theologian enough not to buy into this initiative. The alliance or ecumenism on the basis of the traditional values did not happen between the Catholic Church and the Russian Church. But the Russian Church tried the same sort of ecumenism based on ideology with the WCC. Now on the basis of a more like left-wing ideology, not on the basis of traditional values, but on the basis of this anti-American resistance. And it seems to be working, I believe, with the WCC, much better than it worked with Catholic Church. So we are dealing with two kind of attempts of creating a new paradigm for ecumenism based not on religion per se, but on the ideological premises. It didn't work with the Catholic Church, at least so far. It may work in the future, who knows? And it seems to be working, at least partially, with the WCC. And the last question was about justice for the ROC and personally for Kirill Patriarch. There were movements to bring them to justice. There were movements to impose sanctions, personal sanctions on Kirill, and they were blocked by Orban, at least in the European Union. Probably it's not the end of the story. Probably there will be new attempts to bring the Russian Orthodox Church to the justice, and I hope they will be more successful, certainly. However, the Church should not be judged as a church, and the hierarchs should not be judged as hierarchs. They should be judged just as perpetrators, as any other perpetrator. That is the thing, to draw a parallel with Ukraine. I believe it has a parallel with the Ukraine situation. In Ukraine, we are walking a very thin ice of balancing between the rule of law and discrimination. The rule of law would imply that anyone, regardless of their ecclesial status, a patriarch, a metropolitan, a monk, a layperson, should be accountable to the law, regardless of their status. That would be the right kind of policy, the correct policy towards dealing with the issue of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Something that had to be done in the beginning. However, in the beginning, even after 2014, after the Revolution of Dignity, what happened? Everyone knew that there were some hierarchs who were supposed to be accountable for the overwhelming support to the regime of Yanukovych from the side of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. But they were spared. They were forgiven because they belonged to a particular jurisdiction, to a particular church structure, to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So there was a sort of negative discrimination or positive discrimination. It depends how you call it. So they were forgiven as individuals because they belong to a particular structure. Nowadays, we're dealing with a different situation when some hierarchy or some people, some members of the church are mistreated, not because they are particular individuals who have committed, crimes, but because they belong to a particular jurisdiction. That is the opposite to the rule of law, and that is something that needs to be avoided. And I think in the case of the Russian church, on the international scale, when it will come to the international tribunal, I think it will be important to take this distinction into consideration. People should be treated not because they belong to the Russian Orthodox Church. That will be a big mistake to condemn the church per se, because it's a complex structure, as we know. But people should be brought to the accountability, to justice, regardless of which church they belong to, as individual perpetrators. So that's something that we need to test in Ukraine first. Then it can be extrapolated, I believe, to the international justice system, something that we need to do together. That would be my answer to this question about accountability and justice. Thank you.